And while this is coming up, well, let's hope it does. If anyone at any point has any questions, please feel free to speak up, put it in the chat. Maybe someone will see it on the side. I've got it kind of minimized so that it's not really taking up a lot of the screen. Um, just, speak up because the questions usually come up at a point when they make sense to discuss it then rather than later on in the presentation. It'll just help keep things a little more current for what we're talking about. So again, this is going to be focus stacking for landscape photography. It's the kind of dissecting a photographic image into pieces and putting them all together. And some might ask, well, what is focus stacking? And it's boiled down to the basics. It is blending multiple images that you shoot from a tripod because you don't want anything to move with different focus points throughout your scene for creating high definition photography. It's not high dynamic range, although it can be, but it is all about high definition with optimal aperture settings being used in the camera to create the maximum sharpness. Now, some people might ask me, why would you bother doing this? And for me, it's because I often print very large images. I've got some you can see on the wall back here are 24 inches wide, and I'm always looking for making sure the images are nice and clear and nice and clean and good focus on them, particularly in images like this one where you have foreground elements that are right at minimum focus distance from my lens, and then images off in the distance that part of the image off in the distance is a long way away. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Question to the group, maybe anyone wants to answer it. What would you think that the optimal f-stop would be for most lenses? Is it going to be f5? Is it going to be f8? Is it f10 or f22 or f32?
Two stops, a lot of people wide open.
Excuse me?
2 stops from wide open.
Some lenses, that is probably correct. And depending on which lens you're using, that varies. And so I always encourage people to, if you get a new lens or you're going to be shooting with a lens, is to go out and test it from a tripod, set up and take the same picture and run with the same focus point and run through your f-stop range. And then look at those images when you get back to your computer and start to examine which ones are sharper than others. This image on the left, at full screen, it looks okay. But when can y'all see my pointer moving or no?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm used to doing this where I have a laser pointer where I can point at the screen. So I want to make sure I can actually point things out. You can see that this section of this image is up here. When you zoom into 100%, it is not sharp. And this was shot at f22 as a test to see if this lens was any good at that at that aperture. And it's not. It is all out of focus. It's got a lot of distortion. So when you want to increase your depth of field without shooting at very small apertures, focus stacking becomes a tool that you can use. And that allows us to avoid diffraction. Diffraction is what happens, is the result of shooting at very small apertures on lenses. I have lenses that are quite expensive, but at f16, they are mushy. They are not any good. And their best aperture is f8, f10, rather than shooting at something really small that people usually think that gives them better depth of field to shoot at f22.
What lens were you using with this one?
This lens was the Canon 17 to 40L. So that was an L series lens that was, a pretty pricey lens back in the day when I bought it. And it's not sharp in the corners when you're shooting at f22. But this was a test this was one of the first times I took it out when I first got it. and was trying to find out what the best aperture was for that lens. And for that lens, it was right at f8, but that's an f4 lens. But f8 was a nice sharp depth of, nice sharp images in the corners, and I could use that to blend images. Another reason to use focus stacking is if you're using a lens that is not a wide angle lens at f16, a 16 millimeter or 12 millimeter or 24 millimeter. When you're shooting with, like in this scene, a 50 millimeter lens, the depth of field is much smaller at what normally would be an f-stop that gave you a lot of depth of field. You can see here I have two focus points shown out. This is where my focus point was set in camera, and this is where my focus point was set in camera for the second bracket of this shot. When I focus back here at f11, you can see that these ferns in the foreground are not sharp. But when I focus on them, you can see that they are all of a sudden very sharp. You can see the detail in between the different little fronds. And if you were to think about printing this, 24 inches wide by maybe 30 inches tall, and you're viewing it at 100%, the viewer is going to see that. Are they going to notice it on Facebook or Instagram? No, probably not. But if you're going to be displaying it in a competition or in a show or as part of a club exhibit, you always want to try to present the best image possible. And sometimes that comes from using focus stacking as a tool. This image was actually shot in 3 different pieces. It was shot for this one section here, and then it was shot for this section in the middle, and then it was shot for everything in the background with the focus point being back here. But for demonstration, when you're focusing on the far point, you can see that the near point falls out of focus. Another scene that most people might see and think, oh, I don't need to focus stack on that. I'm just going to set my focus point for the trees here and be done with it. But in reality, I ended up focusing in 2 different places for this image, because if I focused in the back, the trees and everything in this area were sharp and they were fine. And you can see the difference. When you're focused on the foreground, the trees go out of focus and they're soft. If you focus on the background, the trees are sharper. There's more detail in the rocks. The same goes for the flowers. I know this probably doesn't show as well on Zoom. But in the actual images, when you're focused on the foreground, this is nice and sharp and has better color, especially in all of the little textures. And then when you focus on the background, the flowers go soft. And I actually have a pretty good size print of this picture now that is really nice and clean and crisp. And it was because I used focus stacking to create better depth of field in the image. And it's just as easy as taking 2 pictures. You take one for back here and you take one for the front and then blend them together. We're going to get into the blending part. So sometimes you take a photograph and it might be a month or 2 before you get to it. Sometimes for me, it might be 6 months before I get to editing that image. And I might forget that I focus stacked this set of images, or I might forget where I focus stacked this set of images. And some cameras, like the Canon line, you can use some of the Canon software and it'll actually show you where the focus point was. But some cameras it can't, or the Lightroom doesn't read that information. So when you're looking at these 3 images on the screen in the computer, how do you remember which one was which? And I've seen a lot of different presentations on focus stacking and a lot of YouTube videos, and they all kind of leave out this one step. And this is the thing that to me is really important for keeping track of your images when you're in the field. And that's simply using a finger to kind of point where you focused in general for the image. And the way I do that is I will get the focus acquired in camera, take the picture, and then the next frame right after it, I hold my finger out in front of the camera lens. It looks really silly when you're in the field, but it tells me that I used this little point for focus. I used this little top of this rock, and then I used the far point. And it leaves no doubt in your mind when you come back to editing your images where your focus points were, if you don't have a way to display that. So the first step once you get back into your digital darkroom is you're going to take the 3 different pieces of the image and put them all together. For the previous image, the bottom part of this is where I focused for that stuff in the foreground. And again, that stuff was really close to minimum focus distance from my camera lens. It was only about 16 inches away. The camera was set low right up next to it so that all that texture comes out. And then you're looking at the middle section around that rock and everything in the middle for the next frame. And then the last piece of that is the mountains off in the distance. And so you're kind of looking at those in Lightroom or whatever your photo processing software is, and you're kind of visualizing what pieces you need from each individual image when you bring them into Photoshop to layer them. And I do this differently than a lot of people. A lot of people will say that they let Photoshop do the stacking by itself. And for me, I like to have a little bit more fine control over that. I've had images where Photoshop tries to stack it and says, well, we didn't feel like we needed that third one that you shot, and then the image isn't as sharp or it errors out. And for me, it just seems to be easier to do this manually blending rather than letting Photoshop do it. So I always put whatever my foreground layer is, I put it on the bottom. Oh, we're getting some feedback from somebody's. Okay. So the foreground image goes on the bottom, and then all of the other images get layered on top of it, so that if you think about kind of piecing them on top of each other, the stuff that's furthest away will be at the very top, and then the middle ground in the middle, and then the stuff at the bottom is the first layer, because we're going to paint out with a layer mask the stuff we don't want to see from this one. So you can kind of see roughly that the mask hides everything that's in the lower portion of this image, which will reveal the base image, that is the focus point for the stuff in the very foreground. And then this is going to reveal the midground. And because we put the background on the top layer, we don't have to blend this part out up here, because it isn't going to show, because the distance image is on top. And at that point, we would use a brush to put a layer mask on and get rid of everything down below it, so that you're piecing the 3 pieces together in kind of like a puzzle. And you can be more fine-tuned with painting it in your layer and your layer mask than I'm showing here. This is just for representation purposes. I usually come in and try to go around and figure out exactly where that focus needs to be. But once you get into the background, it really is pretty easy to just leave that mountain in the background, because it's going to be nice and sharp. And the final image is one that is very nice and clean. And so what I do then, before I do any other editing, is I will merge those 3 or sometimes 4 images into one frame in Photoshop. And from that point, start doing the rest of your editing. Because what Photoshop will do is it will say, I'm taking all three of those and I'm blending them into the one based on all of your layer masks, so that you can edit everything put together as one file, rather than your edits would be applied to one layer or the other. And what that does is it lets you, if you get further along in your editing and you realize that you've done something wrong, you can go back and start over and fix this without flattening everything and having to start all the way over at the beginning. So this is just kind of an iterative process to edit through the image. Any questions about that? Because that's usually the part that results in a question or two, is the setting up the layers and the masking. Okay. So this can be applied to multiple different kinds of imagery. Again, it usually comes about when you have a strong foreground element that you want to keep in focus, along with midground and background elements that you want also to be in focus. Because you could shoot this image with a shallow depth of field and highlight the leaf here and let all of that stuff fall out of focus, or you can shoot it and want good sharpness from front to back. So you can kind of see that I shot this one in 4 different places, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's the 4 different pieces that get blended together, and they're right along water lines, which makes it a little easier for the blending. But the result is an image that has good sharpness in the foreground, in the midground, and then into the background and on into the distance. Otherwise, when you focus here at the foreground, all of this is out of focus. And even at f8, all of the trees in the background will lose the sharpness around the leaves. And when printed, that can show up, and it can be detrimental to the image quality.
So Travis, in this instance, are these 4 shots all at f8?
These 4 shots would all be at the same aperture. And I think for that particular lens, I was shooting at f8 or f10. I can't remember. But yeah, you don't change your aperture between shots. You keep your because think about it.
Yeah.
If you shoot this at f2.8, the front of the leaf might be in focus, but in f2.8, the stem of that leaf could already be out of focus.
Yeah, no, what I was looking for was just to understand roughly what aperture you used on all of those shots.
Right? They're probably all at f8. The lens I was using at that time for that was good between f8 and f10. But it maximizes the depth of field in each section of the image. You don't want to shoot too shallow, because then you're going to have 50 images that you go in and stack. If anyone's done any macro photography or really close-up photography, you know that if you shoot those at a wide aperture, your depth of field is razor thin. It's almost like shooting with a prime lens for shooting portraits, where the eyes can be in focus, but the nose is out of focus.
Right.
The same thing can happen in landscape photography. If you're shooting wide open, you can have just a little bit of it in focus, and it falls out of focus very quickly either side of your focal plane. So shooting at something like f8 gives you more depth of field in each section of the image.
And these are all manual focus, or are these automatic focus, or what?
The cameras I use, the autofocus is much better than my eyes, even with focus peaking. But I do double check it for each frame. I will, before I move the focus point, I will take the image and then zoom in on it in live view in the camera and double check to make sure that it is actually good and in focus. I do have some lenses that are still manual, so I have to check those, but I usually let my camera set use the autofocus feature to my advantage, because autofocus features of most modern cameras is really phenomenally good. Better than my eyes that have needed corrective lenses since I was 5. So, but always double check. I mean, I always double check my focus. A couple of years ago in the Smokies, I didn't double check focus on what I thought was going to be a mega composition. And I got back to the computer and the first glance was, oh, that's such a good shot. And when I zoom in, it's all out of focus because I missed my focus point and it just wasn't in focus. It happens. So I always double check everything in the field, or try to remember to. Even a scene like this one where you have what seems to be a big scene that you're shooting with a wide angle lens, if you're trying to focus on the far distant hills, the flowers in the foreground fall out of focus. And this is an easy one to blend because you just kind of paint along the line of the hillside to get the middle ground and just kind of go around the middle hill and then the far hill and then the far distance. You can bring all of those together and get a much sharper image. And sometimes, to me, it creates a really neat three-dimensional effect when you have so much of that that's nice and sharp. I know there were some folks that were shooting some astrophotography. Now, astrophotography is where I really started to learn how to use focus stacking for this kind of thing, because of the fact that in astrophotography, you are shooting at very wide apertures. Because you're out at night, you're trying to let all the light in, you're not going to shoot at f8. And so if you focus on the foreground elements at f2.8, you can see that the background stars and mountains are very soft and out of focus and not appealing and not what you want for the image. So you have to focus on the foreground elements and the stars to bring the two images together. But what this also allows you to do is to take a much longer exposure for your foreground that you can then shoot at a lower ISO for a cleaner image and avoid star trails, because you can see at the 120 seconds, the stars are starting to stretch out into star trails. And then you can shoot the proper duration shot for the stars, which leaves the foreground dark. But then you can blend them together to create more of what your eye is seeing in the dark, or to highlight your foreground elements. And it's a very simple blend for this one. I just shoot the stars, that's everything, the mountains in the background from pretty much this flat horizon. And then the stones are in the middle, or in the foreground, and those are another shot. It's very easy to blend that one together. A nice clean mask that starts right there at the base of the mountains. But it gives you that great depth that you can't get when shooting astrophotography at a wide aperture. So this is where I really started to learn how to use focus stacking and in shooting astrophotography, so that I could portray those foreground elements along with the background in an image that otherwise you can't do if you don't blend the two images together.
And Travis, can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
So how many seconds did you have on the third shot?
This is a combination of these two.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So it's 20 seconds, and
it's 20 seconds for the stars to get them nice and sharp, and it's 120 seconds for the foreground at a lower ISO so that it's cleaner, because there's lots of texture in here that would start to get a little muddy and a little grainy at the 3200 ISO that the stars were shot at.
So don't change the aperture, but changing the ISO will
correct.
Okay.
There's multiple techniques going on to shoot this kind of an image.
Sure.
You could do it without that for sure. You could leave your ISO the same and shoot. I think I dropped it to 800, so that's 2 stops lower. Math doesn't work out that way. There's 3 stops there. But you could still shoot your foreground at the same 3200 ISO or 1600 ISO, whatever you're shooting it at. I just did it so that I have a cleaner image in the front. And because I wasn't worried about movement, there's nothing moving here. The 120 seconds, the camera takes that longer exposure, puts a little more light into it, and then I blend in the darker frame of the stars up top. So this is the one on the right is a blended image of the 20 seconds for the stars and 120 seconds for the rocks in the foreground.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Travis, Marvin, can I ask you a question?
Do I hear someone?
Can you hear me better now?
I can hear it better now, yes.
My name is Michael Parvin. I had a blending question for you.
Okay.
When you're blending and you're cleaning up a layer and painting out what you don't want, are you using a soft round brush to do that with?
Yes, I use a brush with a feathered edge so that it's not a hard stamp. That allows you to be a little softer on your edges, and you won't have such hard edges. Yes.
Well, what happens then as those two edges are merged? If you're using a soft brush, does that distort the focus at all when you blend the two images together, or is that just
using that? If you've got everything that didn't move when you shot your pictures, then you shouldn't have any distortion, and it really gives, for me, it gives a much smoother transition between images. And a lot of it is just looking at it and seeing where the focus starts to fall off. And then you just blend back to that very softly. No, I have not had any trouble using a soft edged feathered brush in Photoshop. I have more trouble, that it's more jarring if it's a hard edged 100% hardness brush rather than using one that's got a nice feathered edge to it. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
So I think maybe what he's also asking is how do you deal with focus breathing?
The focus breathing, when you stack them all together and you let Photoshop align the images, it pretty much takes care of the focus breathing, and the lens I use only loses about 2 pixels between its front and back focus points. On a landscape image, you got to remember, it's not like a fast prime that's trying to focus on like my face and then my background, where you have a lot of focus breathing. We're only moving, the elements are only moving a tiny amount. It's small adjustments. Now, in these astro images, you might get a little bit more focus breathing, but Photoshop does a pretty good job of aligning the base layers and getting them pretty square. I haven't really had any issues shooting at this kind of stuff with wide angle. I can see that if you're using a macro lens or a prime and shooting much wider apertures, you can run into more trouble with that. But typically, I haven't had a problem with it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So like the last one, we had a foreground element and a background element. Well, this one I decided, and when I was out shooting, it stepped it up a notch even more. I have a foreground element, I have a midground element, and then I have the background. So for this one, it's 3 different focus points, because at f2.8, this rock would be in focus and this one would be out, or this one would be in focus and this one would be out, or the stars will be out of focus. And you can see in the far left one for the foreground, the stars are kind of bloomed, they're a little orbed, and they're not pinpoint sharp. You can also see that the mountains in the background are not pinpoint sharp. So this is just a simple focus on this rock, and then my focus image for the stars. And this particular lens was really good about not having focus breathing problems. It's a prime 18mm lens, and it did not suffer from focus breathing. Now, there are some lenses that do, and in that case, you have to kind of shoot a little loose, because what happens is Photoshop will align it as best it can, and what you lose is the outer edges of the image. So if you have a lens that you know has a focus breathing problem, that if you rack from front focus to back focus and the image shifts a lot, you might want to plan for that and shoot just a little bit wider than your composition needs to be, so that you can crop it in post. But you can see that this rock is in pretty much the exact same position it is when it's focused on the rock as when it's focused on the background. That particular lens was so good for astrophotography. I don't know why I ever sold it. I shouldn't have. But then blending the three together, this one was a little trickier because I had to come in and kind of find where the focus started to fall off in this image. And that was right about in here. And I actually went in and tried to trace over the little cracks in the mud to create a fairly detailed mask on where to blend it. And then again, for this one, for the middle, again, I followed the line from the front image and found a point where it started to fall off just past that rock, and let that be my middle image. And then I let the stars image capture everything from about this point back, because the textures in the playa weren't as strong back here as they are in the front. They're not really that part of the image. The textures right in the front are what's really important. And so then blending them all together to get the final output image.
Where were these taken?
This is the racetrack playa in Death Valley, both of these, this one and the last one.
Okay.
Great place to go to because it's really dark and you're really all by yourself. It was just the four of us, but it takes about 6 hours of bouncing around in a four-wheel drive vehicle to get there and back. You do like 30 miles at less than 10 miles an hour. So it takes quite a bit of determination to get out there. But once you're there, you've got this place all to yourself, and it's pretty amazing. So.
Cool.
So I like to open it up to questions. I can go back to slides and talk about things. We can have discussion. What have we got? Any questions?
Hey, Travis, one thing I think Michael was talking to about blending the different layers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you run through your process, or if you have Photoshop, just kind of pop it so we could, because I guess the question came up is, how do you keep the sharpest one in front of the other one as you blend them?
Okay, that's what this was about.
Yeah.
So again, I put my base, my foreground layer at the very bottom of my stack. You can see my layer stack here in Photoshop. So the foreground layer is the bottom one, and the middle ground layer, that's this one, is next. It's above it. And then the distance image is above that. So you can kind of see in here, the black part is what's been painted out, because the black painting obscures things. And so when I turn on just the middle ground layer, you can see what is being used in the middle ground layer. And it layers over top of the base layer if you turn them all on. It's just stacking them, the base one down at the bottom, then the middle one, and then the distance image is on top. So that when I leave this part exposed, it covers up all of this image and this image. It just simplifies what I have to mask out. And it also makes it so that if I don't paint just right, it doesn't overlap. It doesn't leave a gap where there's nothing, where there's just the background. That's one reason I layer them like this, so that this one lays over top of it and seamlessly just kind of covers up the part of this image that I don't want to see, and then this one again covers up the parts of this image that I don't want to see. Is that answering your question, or?
Yeah, it does. One question on your blending mode. Which of the blending modes? I think you said that you blend the layers as well.
It's just a normal blending mode. It's not, they're not
just normal.
Yeah, they're not done as duplicate or multiply or anything like that. It's just purely laying them on top of each other and covering up the parts I don't want to see of each individual image.
Yeah, one thing I did like is how you explained that when you had your 3 images that you ran Photoshop's auto align.
Yep.
I think that was good to clarify.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have said that. Yeah, letting Photoshop auto align, it usually will crop out. It gets them really close, and it usually loses just a little bit on the edges just from any kind of focus breathing. But for wide angle lenses, sometimes it's not too terrible bad.
Could you explain that focus breathing?
I'm trying to think if I have an image that I could try to figure out how to make it work. Focus breathing is a artifact of the inside a lens. There are moving elements, and if you have something here, I think maybe I can show it. Let's see here. So if I put my fingers up over the lens here, you see how the things in the background move?
Yeah, out of
you see
focus.
How watch this picture frame right here. When it focuses on my fingers and then goes back to me, there's a little bit of movement because the stuff that's close, it's moving the lens elements a long way. So if I sit even further back, it would happen more. That's when that happens, the lens elements change where they're at. So it slightly changes the magnification of the subject that's being displayed to the sensor. That's something that is combated a lot for video. For still photography, we don't usually notice it. When you're shooting video a lot, you do notice it when you rack focus from being either out of focus to in focus, or changing your focus in a shot from the front, from something in the front to something in the back. You don't want to see that movement of the lens elements moving. In wide angle photography, it's not as bad because the lens elements are not moving from their shortest distance from each other to their longest, or back and forth. So you have to think of it, lens elements move back and forth. Think about this. Anyone that has a zoom lens that has an internal zoom or an external zoom, when you look at the rear element and you rack the focus from one side to the other, that element moves. So you can see it happen, and you can see all of the elements inside the lens moving when you rack focus. And that's what causes focus breathing. It's a natural thing that happens when, telephoto lenses are really bad about it. The lens I used to use a lot was a very compact lens, so it didn't have, the lens elements didn't move very much, which made it great for about everything.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it.
Focus breathing was something I learned more about when I started doing video. I had never really even paid much attention to it being really bad until I started doing a lot of video. But it can affect images and stills depending on what kind of lens you're using.
Yeah, I'd never thought about it before, but I appreciate it.
So can I ask a question about, it's pretty basic, but are you just setting up your tripod, putting a focus point on your foreground, and then not touching your lens at all, but changing your focus point? Is there any other changes you're making? And then
That is the only change I try to make is moving the focus point.
not, but like on that one dark one, you said you had to change the ISO.
Well, that one's quite a bit different in that I'm doing more than just focus blending. And for that one, I actually used, because I didn't want to cause a lot of shake in the camera, I actually used my phone because my phone can connect to my camera. I kind of cheat. It can connect to the camera and I can control all of the settings for ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. I can't change where it focuses.
You're not touching the camera, just changing settings.
That's correct. I'm just changing settings. And you know, for this one, I mean, the cameras I use have like 493 focus points available to me. I don't know if anyone's used to the old Canons that had 8 little squares on your viewfinder. I have 493 capable spots, so I can move it anywhere. That's one thing that is really nice about some of the modern cameras is you have a whole lot more points where you can select focus. With an older Canon, you might have the focus point that you use right here in the front, and then the one that's up here, and then one over here, and then one in the back. It's possible to do it if you only have 8 or 10 focus points available to you because of whatever camera it is. But a lot of the modern ones, and I can just move it with the little joystick on the back. It shifts the little focus point around and it says, here's where you want to focus. And that's what I pick. Just spreading it out as I go. And I typically will shoot my foreground and I'll work into the image as I progress through the shots.
And you use just a single focal point, focus point every time.
Yep. I use the single point focus and I control it where it goes. I'm not letting the camera try to pick where it goes. At this point, you're trying to take a lot of control, and so don't let the camera try to control what it's going to give you. You tell the camera what you want. Turn that back on.
We got any more questions? Sounds like we got a whole lot of experts going now.
I checked the chat. I didn't see any there. So,
Hey Travis, is there anything in the chat that
I just checked it? No, there was just a couple of confirmations.
Well, I'd personally like to thank you, and of course for the club as well, in your presentation this evening. It's nice to have another tool in our toolbox, really.
Yeah, it's not something you're always going to use, but I mean, you know, for these images, this stuff was literally right in front of the camera. It's so close to it, and to lose the texture in all of this would have been criminal, because that texture is so neat, and it creates such a nice 3-dimensional feel to an image that in some cases that's the best thing to shoot it with. If you didn't have an interesting foreground element, then you wouldn't necessarily need to do that or go through the trouble of it. But if you've got interesting stuff in the foreground, the midground, and the background, then I say, why not? Go for it.
Well, I, for one, have learned awful lot. Thank you, Travis. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I appreciate y'all having me.
Beautiful photographs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And forgive me, can I ask one question? Because I came in late.
Absolutely.
And I just drooled when you mentioned over 400 focal points. What are you shooting with?
I now have a Sony A1 and a Sony A9. They have 493 focus points in single point mode. It
Wow.
covers 90% of the viewfinder.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And your pictures are beautiful.
It allows you to pick literally this corner, that corner, that corner, that. I mean, you're not limited to a couple of quadrants on the screen. It has been a game changer on what you're allowed, what you can pick your focus point on.
Hey, Travis, I would comment, first of all, thank you very much. Nice presentation, useful information. And doing a good bit of landscape type stuff myself, I've never messed with focus stacking and never wanted to. And now absolutely it is in my plans to use this trick going forward, because I have some photos right now where I really wish the foreground were a little sharper.
Yeah.
Everything else looks great. But this technique would have solved that issue for me. So.
Yeah. The whole third of the way in works for probably 75 to 80% of landscape photography.
Yeah, I can see why 2 images is often enough, 2 or 3.
Yeah, and I've been in discussions with people that said, well, I shot 12 different images for a landscape shot. I'm like, well, I think you shot 9 too many.
Maybe the macro.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing macro, you're going to shoot 60. And you're going to use a program that stacks those together. But for landscape photography, you can really make it kind of easy on yourself. And 2, 3, sometimes 4. But I've never had to do more than 4. And most of that was when I was just trying to learn more about it. So,
well, it'll also force me to take a little bit closer look at Photoshop, which I've avoided like the plague for most of my life. But when I have to do something with it.
Hey, it's not that scary once you dive into it. I've been using Photoshop
it's terrifying, admit it. It's terrifying, but I'll
too.
Maybe. I've been using Photoshop since 96 or 97. So it doesn't scare me.
Well, thanks again. Good job.